Hello and welcome to this episode of Keeping Her Keys. Yes, I do have a squeaky voice from a cold. I am mostly getting better. It's not COVID. I'm fine. I'm squeaky voicing Coyote Mae. Um, I'm joined again today by Coyote Mae. So Coyote Mae and I talked last time, a few months ago, about queerness and the goddess, and it was such a really powerful conversation. And I wanted to have Coyote Mae back on the show to talk about another big issue. So this big issue we're going to be unlocking for everyone today is what spiritual programming is and ways we can recover from dogmatic thinking, and also how this all intersects with paganism and identifying as witches. So there's a lot for us to explore in this episode. Um, if you're watching or listening to this and you hear some thumping and banging in the background, we're having major renovations done on the house. Listen, I've been dying to have this conversation with Coyote for weeks and weeks, and I didn't want to reschedule it. So if you're watching or listening, you might hear nails and things happening in the background. And we are just going to be 100% real because sometimes life is squeaky voiced with a nail gun in the background. So, shall we begin? I didn't let you say hello. Say hello. Sorry. It's not. I'm
That's
not. I'm not going to let you
fine.
talk
That's
for
totally
today.
fine.
What's happening?
Hi. Yes, I'm Coyote Mae. I am really happy to be here. I'm excited to talk about this topic. It's something that's kind of always been a little interesting to me as a person who was not really raised in any kind of formal religion. So yeah, it's been something that I kind of both see from the outside and then also realize how that spiritual programming gets in no matter what you do. So I'm looking
It's
forward to this talk.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's so insidious. So,
Hmm.
well, let's begin. You got your candle ready?
I do.
So let's begin as we always do by casting that counterclockwise circle, just cleansing the space, removing any barriers to really engaging with this important topic of spiritual programming. And let's cast the circle around us, protecting us and connecting us to this topic and to the energy of what Coyote May and I will be sharing in the next hour. And our invocation for today is from Entering Hecate's Cave. And it's in the Rixipyle chapter, which is all about liberation. And it's also where I talk about spiritual programming and creating your own religion. So I thought it would be appropriate if this was our invocation for today. My goddesses are wild and free, inconvenient, independent, rebellious resistors, revengers. My goddesses are wild and free, hunting the wicked, conquering monsters, turning fools into swine, driving dragon chariots across the sun, shining pale moon beams, burning torches, all the stars above, and the deepest depths. My goddesses are wild and free, many faces, many moods. They scare the life into me. Shakers, movers, chain breakers, dream haunters, screaming whispers, dead silence. Enduring, changing, fleeing, remaining, my darkest desires and my brightest dreams. My goddesses are wild and free, death walkers, truth talkers, trouble makers, impatient with fakers, claiming those they desire, casting others into the fire. My goddesses are wild and free, answering my call, showing up uninvited, forever traveling their road, leaving behind a trail that I choose to follow. My goddesses are wild and free. So that to me I wrote this. Do you know the story about what inspired me to write this poem?
No, I don't.
So several years ago, when I first started keeping her keys, I wrote a blog on a platform, Patheos, which is a big spirituality and religion website, and I had a blog on that, and the I wrote for the pagan channel, it's called,
Hmm.
and the channel manager at the time, we were talking, and I said something about I don't consider myself a religious person at all.
Hmm.
And they said to me, "You're one of the most religious people I know." And so it really was a sort of key that unlocked something. And, I was like, "Am I a religious person?" I write rituals, I write about the goddess Hekate. I had never really considered myself to be a religious person. And so I started to kind of do like an inventory, a personal spirituality inventory,
Hmm.
almost like how you do a bias inventory, to see
Right.
like where you're hidden by. But I started to do like about my own spirituality. And I was like, well, I could see how from an outsider this might seem like there's a lot of like structure and rules and all of the things that I associated with religion. Because unlike you, I was raised in the Pentecostal church. So I was raised in a very dogmatic, fundamentalist, sometimes very beautiful and like very spiritual, but also really misogynistic and all of those
Hmm.
other things, right? So I had really rebelled against that and was very anti-religion in my personal life. That's that led me on a quest for quite a few months. And then I think I read one of those articles that you read where it's like how to worship the goddess Bridget. You must do this and you must do that and this and that. You know what I mean? Those kind of articles.
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
And at the time, I was researching Medea and Circe a lot,
Hmm.
because they went on to be kind of really central to my book, Entering Hecate's Garden. And this was before the Circe novel came out.
Hmm.
And I really could find nothing on them. There were none of those articles like how to worship the Morgan, 5 steps for getting it right with the Morgan. There was
Right.
nothing on either one of them. And it led me to think, like, why am I drawn to these expressions of the sacred feminine that never seem to be very popular? Like, why are they the ones that unlock something in me?
Right.
Because when I first became enamored with Hecate, there was very little
Yeah.
about Hecate out there. And so, yeah, and so I was thinking about Medea and Circe and why do they kind of refuse to be pushed into neat little books? And why do they, like why these incredible mythic figures,
Hmm.
they never even got their own stories,
Right.
right?
Right.
They were stars in somebody else's story. The story they were so, what was I trying to say? Not They were not the stars of their own story.
Right.
They were minor characters in somebody else's story.
Some bloke story.
Although Medea did have her own opera,
Hmm.
but they were both really, you could tell they had this sort of enchantment because in art, ever since their story, their bit parts in Odysseus and Jason's story, ever since then, that story had been expanded on in the art, in Euripides playing Medea, and in
Hmm.
all the art that exists depicting Circe and Medea. I was like, and to me, it was just like, they're just out of bounds. They don't, there's something about their whatever it is they symbolize,
Hmm.
that deeper energy of the wild and free goddess. To me, that's what I am naturally drawn to. And so I wrote that poem because I don't think that for me, like any kind of face of the sacred feminine that bends the knee to the rules of man is not one that I am necessarily going to really deeply connect with.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It does. And as you're saying that, I'm thinking about my own path and how, when I was very young, I was, typical child born in the mid 70s. Like I grew up watching Clash of the Titans, like, all of these things that I'm just, and, just had this insatiable thirst for the Greek myths. And, you know, um, so I think when I first became, on this path, I don't know, this witchcraft path, I really kind of connected to, the kind of well-known ones, Aphrodite, Athena, but I was always really drawn to those on the outside. The ones that really called to me were, like Kali,
Mm,
Hekate, Dionysus, Pan, these figures and these gods and these goddesses that lived really like outside of the structure of society or the well-behaved. They are not well behaved. They are not, the goddesses and gods that people think of as being nurturing first, or being, I don't know, good role models or, you know, I mean, they were great role models for me. I mean, I just,
right?
growing up, I was given a lot of freedoms growing up, I think, but in a sense that as long as I was getting good grades and as long as I was on my path to college and as long as I, did the things that I was asked to do around the house. Um, but I think because of that, I had that taste of freedom, but I didn't have, like there was something that was like, I don't want to be well behaved. I don't want to keep
Mm,
getting good grades. I had these friends that were living wilder lives whose parents maybe weren't as strict or as involved or whatever, who were going out partying. And there was a part of me that was like, that's not for me. But at the same time, I was like, but I kind of want it to be.
hmm
So I wonder, like, I wonder how that plays into things, just that idea of that freedom and that just shaking off the bonds of society and doing whatever I wanted to do. So,
Right. I think that's such a good point because I don't think either of us are here to criticize or poke fun at people who do find comfort and succor and identification with like a highly structured religion,
oh,
whatever it
absolutely
may
not.
be. Like we're
Yeah,
not,
absolutely.
I mean, this is very personal. It's
Hmm.
about our own journey. We are both kind of the wild ones, kind of born to rebel and push back against society. That is just how we're made.
Right. Yeah. No, there's definitely some comfort in structure. And I'm learning that as I get older too. So,
Right.
yeah, you
You
can
have to,
definitely have some appreciation for it.
yes. So structure is good. And if you're like us and you're always going to be on the outside of structure, looking in or learning to connect with structure to strengthen your own life, that we're coming from a very different place from people who I imagine really want to walk into like an established religion, be it a mega church, a synagogue, a mosque, some kind of pagan organization. They want to walk into something that's already well established and it's clear, what's expected. There's a clear, preordained, pre-created path to the divine that one can follow, and that you just show up and do the things. So if that's your path, I'm not here to criticize you. That is not the conversation we're having. That's not who we are. So we're really here to talk about what I term spiritual programming or spiritual conditioning. I've heard it called that as well. We're here to talk about the really subtle and insidious ways that both our personal upbringing for me and the greater cultural context for you, Coyote May,
Hmm.
really influence how we go about creating our own personal religion and what we think is acceptable and not acceptable, and our views of the divine, which can be really strange. Um, when I originally wrote that poem, I didn't put the verse in Entering Hecate's Cave because I thought, oh, this is a little bit much. There's another verse that says, you say you put your goddesses on a shelf and that they come on your command. I don't understand. My goddesses are wild and free. because I do feel, as an outsider, as someone who doesn't connect from the inside out with a highly structured religious group or path or a dogmatic way to the divine, like I really do sometimes feel like, from my outsider gaze, that other people who are like, well, if I do this ritual this way, Hecate is going to give me a boon and life will be good. Or if I put $20 on underneath her statue or pour this booze, this libation, then I'll get exactly what I want from Dionysus. I have never been able to wrap my head around that. And
Right.
I'm not apologizing for myself, but I'm also not criticizing other people. For me, I see that and it was like, why? If the divine of our understanding is so vast and is somehow involved in this fabric of the universe, why would they give one flying fig about me just quickly sticking $20 under a statue without any kind of serious energy or authenticity underneath of it?
Right.
I used to be really fascinated by the Catholic Church because I was raised Pentecostal, and I thought, well, the Catholics, it's got to be better than the Pentecostals. I mean, the music in the Pentecostal church, obviously, you can't get better music than that. But the whole rigmarole of the Catholic Mass, I used to sneak go to Catholic Mass behind my parents' back. I'll rebel against anything.
I can
Um,
definitely relate to that though, because I think about before I found witchcraft, I was very enamored, like you said, like by the ritual of things and by, like the lighting of the candles and, but I think there's like a very big difference between people who do these things kind of like on autopilot and
mhm.
people who do them with intention, you know.
That's so important. So
Mhm.
intention. And I've often thought about, like, I mean, I think you used the great expression, autopilot.
Mhm.
Like, why do religion or spiritual practices on autopilot? Like, what would be the point? Like, for me, I don't see the point of doing, I tend to be a very intentional person. Like, I do things because they have a purpose to me.
Right.
Um, so it's like, why do you do things on autopilot if, in terms of spirituality, like, you don't have to do spirituality in order to live.
Right.
That's not really a question, but you know what I'm saying? Like,
I do. And in fact, I was just thinking about how, even when we do our triformis, ceremony when we open here, like we just did with the candle, I mean, like every time we do that, and it doesn't matter how many times I've done that, I always take that moment to like go within myself and feel the feelings and really feel how it feels to banish things or to call things in as we're going through the motions. And, and it's something, I mean, I do this, I wouldn't say every day, but very often, this is a kind of ritual that I go through very often. And it could be, I mean, I could totally switch to autopilot with it. And I never have, it's just, it's always something like, it's like, take the 2 seconds or 10 seconds or 30 seconds or 1 minute or 10 minutes that you need to get into the feeling of what you're doing, I mean, it doesn't take a long time and it changes everything, in my opinion.
I think that's so true, and that's like the number one way to kind of get over spiritual programming. So I think I would define spiritual programming as the like an unconscious set of schema or rules that govern how we practice our spirituality. Now, for us, spirituality, kind of to slap a broad label on it, as much as we don't like those labels, we would, I think I would say my spirituality is really centered around the witch. I don't know. How would you define your spirituality?
I think first I would call myself an animist.
Oh, that's a
Um,
good one. Yeah.
yeah, I very much connect with the energies of things and places. So for me, even holding the candle, it's like I connect with the candle. When I turn it on, I connect with the light, or when I light, a flame, I connect with the flame. And the witchcraft for me is a tool to do that, if that makes sense.
Oh, that makes sense. That's really good. Well
Yeah.
stated. Because I am definitely an animist too. I believe that all things have souls, um, things have consciousness, especially anything from the natural world has
Mhm.
a consciousness. It may be different than our human consciousness, but it doesn't mean they don't have a consciousness. I believe that places have consciousness, and like the ocean has a
Mhm.
consciousness. The cove behind the house has a kind of different kind of consciousness than the big ocean.
Right.
So, yeah, for me, being an animist, I'm just thinking, sorry, this is becoming a podcast because I'm now you gave me something to think about. That witchcraft is kind of a like a container
Mhm.
through which to explore and practice animism.
Yeah. That's definitely how I feel about it.
And sometimes I think that identifying as a witch, first of all, for me as a natural born outsider and rabble rouser, it fits me because witches have always been that. And then also sometimes I wonder if the popularity of the word witch and people identifying as witches, which is wonderful, I think if it's partly because of problems with the English language that we don't have really great words for, like you said, animists, people
Mhm.
who practice herbalism, people who are interested in the deeper world. Like when you look at the historical movements, I guess kind of before witchcraft and adjacent paganism became really popular for people who were seeking something kind of outside of the mainstream that was more animistic and more connected to the natural world.
Mhm.
Then it was like the New Age movement. Before that, it was like the hippies and the LSD crowd.
Right.
And then there was the spiritualist movement. So I feel like we don't have a lot of good names for
Mhm.
this in the
Yeah.
English language.
Yeah.
I
I
would never call myself a shaman.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, I understand like the origins of the word and then how it morphed, like the word witch has morphed in what it's meant. I mean, certainly today in 2023, the definition of witch is incredibly different than what it would have been like even 100 years ago, even 50
Right.
years ago,
Right.
when witchcraft was still illegal in certain places.
Mhm.
So I know words change over time, but I thought about it, several like 20 years ago when I first started teaching meditation classes, because it was people were starting to call themselves shamans at that time, and I had like shamanic training
Mhm.
and worked with like shamanic practitioners. But for me, it just didn't have like that ping. I don't know how to describe it. Like
I do. Yeah. Yeah, because like you, I've had a lot of shamanic training. In fact, I am currently doing more shamanic training. I love the practices. But to me, like to call it's whether you call yourself a shaman or a witch or really any of these labels, I almost feel like it's more than just something that you put on occasionally. It's
mhm.
it's like, is this my life, right? And in that sense, I mean, if I were going to just look at those two labels in particular, I don't, as much as I incorporate shamanic practices into my life, I wouldn't go so far as to say that that is my life, that that's my lifestyle, that that's the fabric of my spirituality or, who I am or how I am in the world. Whereas witch applies a lot more to me as well. And like you said, there's that ping. I mean, sometimes I feel like there's a little bit of shock value in using the term I'm a witch, right? I mean, I
Yeah.
can't lie. There's a little bit of delight I take in saying like, yeah, I'm a witch, and watching people go, "Oh, what is that?" And I love that, I mean, I had a coworker today who I was actually taken a little bit aback by. We were talking about, what did you do last night? And she's like, oh, I did some witchy shit under the full moon. And I was like, really? Because I just would not have, like I just had no idea that there was that side to her, and I think that's incredibly cool, but definitely witch has a lot of power, you know, that label.
I like how you said it has that shock value.
Mhm.
And, for me, I think in terms of spiritual programming, one way of undoing a lot of that is to find or to decide not I don't need a label. Like so it's like what kind of spiritual label fits for you or do none of them fit for you? Um, and just kind of go in that direction of what feels natural and good and do witchy shit under the full moon. But
Right.
the shock value of witch, and the history of witch has been something that has always really called to me. I do feel that there is some kind of like spiritual lineage or ancestry, even though biologically my family is certainly not witchy at all. Um, Although, and sometimes people say that, oh, but they are actually witchy, they just don't call it that. But I have a big issue with slapping labels on other people that they didn't
Mhm.
choose for themselves.
Agreed. Yeah.
So I think that's part of recovering from spiritual programming is letting other people be who they are and you focusing on your own spiritual journey,
Mhm.
and keeping that gaze inward,
Right.
to discover what really nourishes and strengthens you and gives you like a well to draw from when life gets difficult.
Yeah. I think self-determination is so important, especially on our path.
And I
I
think
really
that's
do.
really contrary to a lot of religious teaching, right? Is
Mhm.
that, and for me, there's this, I do believe that there is some kind of like cosmic design or something greater than us that I am part of that
Mhm.
is a sense of destiny or a right journey for me through this life. I don't really know how that all works, but I believe, that there is that. But I also really believe in free will and self determination and that we are the crafters of our own journey,
Mhm.
whether we choose to kind of lean into what feels right for us or not, it's our decision. And I think that's really different, certainly from the church that I was raised in,
Mhm.
where it was like, you had all these rules, and then there was like the whole sin thing. The sin thing is so complicated. It's like, well, you can't go to movies, and if you do this, that's sinning, and oh, if you're queer, that's apparently a sin. Like, I just felt like growing up, like the sin list was endless.
Yeah. That seems so like how do you even how do you even live in the world, when you're thinking, okay, can I do this? Should I do this? I'm doing this, and what does that mean for me? I mean, just thinking about the rules that I grew up with and then having like the church rules on top of it just seems so overwhelming, especially as a young person when you're not really mature enough to make these like discernments into gray areas, right? Like, and you're thinking, oh my gosh, I thought evil towards this person, like, and so now I'm 4 years old and I'm already going to hell. Like, what do you do with that information? Do you try to atone or do you just lean into it, right?
Right? It's like,
Like,
well, maybe that's why I'm here today. It's like, well,
right?
it all started when I was so little.
Yep. The trap was sprung. Oh
The
well.
trap was sprung. I was evil from the get-go, so
Can't
I
put the
just made
toothpaste
the
back in the tube.
right. I made the most of it. Hail
Right.
Hekate.
Exactly.
um, oh, you've got so many great points. It
But I
just
mean,
go ahead.
oh no, I was just going to say, but I mean, even, as a person who didn't grow up in an organized religion, there's still that feeling of like, oh, I'm doing something morally wrong, or I'm doing something, you know, I had a roommate who we would have conversations like this, and she was a recovering Catholic as well, and a witch, and she would say, "You need to let go of that pagan guilt, right? Like I have this guilt of like I can't throw this away; it's still usable, or I can't, like." So, I mean, we all have our programming, like you said, we all have our do and don't lists, right? And I think again, it kind of comes back to self-determination. Like, it's helpful sometimes, I think, to examine some of these beliefs and say, like, okay, this is what I was taught, but is it true for me? You know?
And what is our own moral compass?
Hmm.
Like I think for both of us, we like to do what we can for the environment.
Right.
Um, and like you said, that pagan guilt. Like if
Right.
you're a good pagan, you're gonna compost. You're gonna use cloth bags.
Right.
You're gonna do all these things. You're gonna buy, like you're gonna upcycle, thrift shop.
Right.
You're not gonna go around buying new things. And it's really this just brings back so many memories because for years and years I circled and would go to social events with a really large local pagan group, really wonderful people. But I was always me. I didn't even fit in with them
Right.
because I had a career. Um, and I owned my own home. I was a single mom with two kids, and we lived a fairly middle class life.
Hmm.
Um, and I found that there was that poverty approach. I don't know if you've run into this with the pagans. It's like
We do
you,
talk about that in my family, yes.
you gotta be super poor to be a pagan.
You're
And
right.
I'm
Yeah.
right. And it's like, well, why is that? Like I know historically, I know where the term pagan comes from and being a term to apply to common people.
Hmm.
But I think if you own your own house, that doesn't really make you part of the 1%.
Right. Right.
I don't know. What have you? So I know that you have a large group that you circle with and socialize with where you are in the world. Have you ever run into any kind of like unexpected pagan programming biases kind of things other than like the poverty and the environmentalism ones?
Yeah, it's for me, I think the biggest one is how there will be people that I know who are pagans, especially pagans that are very active in our larger community, and they will on one hand say, I'm so glad I left the church. I got so tired of being told what to do and how to worship and how to move in the world with my gods and how to do this and how to do that. And then you circle with them and they're like, what are you doing? You can't call a circle that way. That's not the lyrics to that song. That's not how we do things. And I always find it kind of amusing, right? Like, because it's like, okay, I do understand the value in having kind of a, for lack of a better term, like a liturgy, right? Or like, a ritual, or, it's just like we do our rituals in Covina. You have these practices that you've trained your brain to recognize now we're in sacred space.
Yeah,
But I also feel like, again, like if you're being so dogmatic that the minutia of how you do those things is more important than the feeling that you get from doing them and the connection to something bigger than yourself that you get from doing them, I think you're missing the point. And I think that's a huge part of spiritual programming. I do.
that you're so detail oriented.
Hmm.
That there's a checklist and you have to do things a certain way. I do think there is a lot of security in that.
Right.
Like, I think it requires a certain type of audacity to be able to say, there's a different way to do this that I feel will achieve the same kind of experience.
Right. Or shake things up a bit, you know?
Shake things up a bit.
Yeah.
One of the funniest stories about the way, the pagan way, it has to be done a certain way. So the very first time I taught an online course it was a program called the Sacred Seven, which has since been retired. And the very first class, this is kind of coincidental because it's just about 5 years ago since I did this first online class. And I had put in the instructions about casting a circle. And
Hmm.
I wrote like from my perspective where I lived in the world, and I said, well, you should call the directions. Here's what it typically is: never eat shredded wheat, northeast, south, and
Right.
west. But you can do it in different ways based on where those actual directions are for you.
Hmm.
So if so for me, where I live, um, the water, so water is typically west,
Hmm.
um, but water is east. So I had mixed it up.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
So I would call water from the actual direction where the actual physical ocean was. And in some of the students in this first class, it caused like an uproar. And
Oh, I can imagine.
they're like,
Yeah.
you can't do that, Cyndi. And I was like, however, the water is actually there, east for me.
Right.
The other three directions are not geographically dependent. Earth is always underneath of us. Fire, who knows where that is? I guess we put it
Right.
to the south.
Fire and air
Um,
do what they want.
right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, and then I was like, oh, so it's not just in kind of like the pagan groups. I've been to lots of pagan festivals and read
Right.
pagan rituals and all this. So I was like, oh, it's also in the more spiritual, witchy world. It's not just the pagan world where
Right.
people
Yeah.
get very uncomfortable when the status quo is shaken up a bit.
I that brings to mind this I was a May Queen at a Beltane festival, a local Beltane festival a few years ago, and they have a bardic circle there. And I wrote this really incredible poem that kind of like um linked my experience of the directions, in that way. And then I taught a little workshop too that was kind of like when you face north, what do you actually feel, right? When you face east, what do you actually feel? Like, and to get people kind of, I called it magical sovereignty or finding your own magic or something like that, because again, it's that spiritual programming. Like, oh, north has to be, earth, or east has to, I mean, it works in my part of the world because I live on the West Coast. I live in Portland. So I have water, the big water is to the west. It's perfect.
Yes,
I have mountains to the north of me. I have,
perfect.
it's hot the further south you go. Okay. And we have our beautiful gorge winds that come from the east. So for me, it works perfectly. But like, that is not the case everywhere. People don't have four seasons everywhere. People
Mm,
don't have, so how do you reconcile that with our traditions, right? And our magical traditions or spiritual traditions that tell you, well, the north is earth because it's cold and it's damp and it's blah blah blah, and the west is water because, and it's like, well, that doesn't make sense for me, or that doesn't feel right to me. And so I think there's a lot of freedom in recognizing like this is a great structure, especially when you're new and you're learning and you have this container that kind of takes away a lot of like the emotional and mental stress of having to figure things out,
mhm,
right? And there's nothing wrong with that. And if it works for you and you continue doing it for the rest of your life, that is awesome. But if you ever have those feelings of like, well, I know this is the way I was taught, but this feels really awkward, like run with that. Figure out what does work for you. I mean, if I could do anything on this earth to empower other magical practitioners, I would say like do what feels right and do it
yeah,
with intention. Like if that is all you take from this podcast, like I feel like my job is done. Thank you.
right. It's like we can go talk about something else.
Right? Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
because it's just like the like living from the center of your being.
Hmm.
If you are involved with a spiritual group or a religion and it is nourishing you and you feel lit up inside, or then that might be for you. But if you feel small and confined, and if you're worried that you're going to mess things up and
Hmm.
bad things will happen to you if you mess things up, then you may want to take some of our advice and maybe read the section in Entering Hecate's Cave and other books like Thomas More's Creating a Religion of One's Own, and exploring what feels right and true for you. And it can be like a process. Like you said, when you first got started with the more popular goddesses, my first goddess was Artemis, because when I was in high school, I went down a rabbit hole. I accidentally, well, not accidentally, it was one of those like the universe or somebody put a book in my hand. I
Hmm.
discovered the meaning of my name. That led me to Artemis, my first love. I still love her.
Hmm.
And and then it just kind of went from there. Then I discovered Isis, who was more popular at the time. If you remember back in the
I do.
90s,
Yeah.
Isis, Isis was the goddess of the
I went
day.
through an ISIS phase also,
Right.
yes.
Sign me up for the Fellowship of Isis.
Right,
Get a little
exactly.
certificate in the mail.
Yep. I do remember those days.
Um, and then, I do feel like, in a way that's really inexplicable, unless someone has had an experience, I do feel like I had some kind of calling or breakthrough or something when I felt really compelled by Hekate to embark on my current journey.
Hmm.
That for me, that doesn't mean I don't love other goddesses. Like I love Artemis and Isis, and certainly our Circe and Medea. I mean, speaking of them, so I published articles way back when I was writing on that popular space, and
Yes.
I called them both goddesses.
Oh my
Oh
gosh.
my,
I am sure that caused a scene.
the pagan accuracy department was activated,
Oh no.
and I it caused like a it caused
A ruckus, yes.
a ruckus,
That's the perfect
and
word.
all I said was, "Look, they may not be goddesses to you, but they're goddesses to me.
Right.
They are my own personal goddesses." Like, the personal Jesus song.
Yes. Your own personal Circe.
So they are goddesses to me. So I guess for me, like while I was writing on Pathos Pagan, I mean, it was such a learning experience, and a lot of it was really wonderful. But what really upset me and caused me a lot of distress, was the constant ruckus I seemed to cause just by like talking about what was true to me and presenting rituals from my perspective, which is very psycho-spiritual, as you know.
Hmm.
Um, and the things I would say, thinking like no one in the world could possibly find this to be controversial. And
Right.
then, oh my goodness, it was caused an uproar. Um, and it was really difficult at the time because, I had had this really complicated relationship with paganism that started when I was really young, probably before I even got out of high school. So we're decades into this complicated thing at this point.
Right.
And, had often circled with pagans and led rituals, both Hecatean and otherwise, for pagan groups. I'd also spent a lot of time in the more like the spirituality world,
Mm.
teaching meditations and workshops and so on. And I never really felt like I fit in either one of those worlds.
Right.
And then writing for Pathos Pagan, seeing all of these people who identified as pagans really just throwing so much shade at everything I did. And then just not being supported kind of by the management under, saying like, oh, well, that kind of stuff is really good for business. It's going to generate more ad revenue
Mm.
because the more kind of hateful conversation and anger energy is associated with an article, the more views and shares it'll get, which means more ad revenue for the owners of
Hmm.
Pathos Pagan, which, let the record show, my witches, is actually evangelical Christians associated with Donald Trump. That's who actually owns that organization. I wasn't making the money. I was
Right.
making maybe $100 a month. So it was just such a quagmire. If you can
Hmm.
imagine, like, can you imagine? It's like I'm trying to talk about something different, which really was popular. I was getting all this pushback. I was being called a bad Wiccan or a bad pagan and getting Hecate all wrong. I didn't understand her. And at first I would try to engage and be like, well, I come at this from a psychological, psychospiritual perspective, not a literalist or a fundamentalist perspective.
Right.
And then if you say fundamentalist, It's like, oh, we're not fundamentalists here. And it was just like this constant mess. I was panic attacking every day because I
Ugh,
want to be like, the super kind of sophisticated one who's like, oh no, those comments don't bother me. They
right.
do.
Yeah, it's hard not to let them, right?
When you're getting like dozens of them every
Yeah.
freaking
It's like an
day,
onslaught. Yeah.
and it makes you question. And I think a lot of this for me as a woman, it's and going out of my own way and step, like and trying to have that self-determination in the world and trying to help other people while I was doing this. I think for me as a woman, there's this fundamental thing like, oh, I must be wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Those white guys, well, they're always right. Even though like I'm such a, resistor and like I usually don't believe them, but I get like that microsecond where
Yeah,
I'm like, oh, if a white guy in charge tells me something, it must be better than what me
right.
knows to be true. But
And
it's like a
there's the cultural programming.
right? It's like a
Yeah.
microsecond thing, and
Yeah.
then I'm like, yeah, throw that out. Does
Right.
that make sense about
It
that microsecond thing?
it does because I think that it just goes to show how strong programming is in our, whether it's cultural, spiritual, or whatever, because, for so many of us, those are the authority figures we've grown up with, whether in our personal lives or in the spiritual lives, or, it's like it has been the dudes in charge or the white dudes in charge, or, and sometimes it's very hard to trust yourself, when you are constantly being told that you don't know what you're talking about. And if I'm being perfectly honest, like that's a huge reason why I think like I don't put more effort into, I always talk about how I want to write a blog. We've talked about
Mhm.
this, like I want to write a blog. I want to do these things. I want to, and I'm just like, I won't lie. Like there's a part of me that's like, I can't deal with that right now. Like I have enough. Like I don't need to deal with this. And, something else you said made me think about how, I think, when you were saying how people were like, you're getting Hekate all wrong and you're this and that. I think that there's even within pagans, the pagan groups or people who are, oh, what's the word I'm looking for? Believe in a lot of different gods or interact with, a lot of different energies. There's still that weird sense of like, if you do this wrong, you're going to be punished.
Right. Like
Right? Like if you light the wrong herb to Hecate, or like if you do your dark moon ritual on the new moon or the, full moon or whatever, like you're going to be smited. Or I don't know. It's just that part is always really interesting to me too. Oh, well, will she be upset with me if I don't have vervain, but I have, mugwort? It's like, no, I'm pretty sure she has bigger fish to fry. Like, and but it's like I have to remind myself, like that's a very, especially when you're brought up in some of the more, fundamentalist traditions, whether it's Christian or any other religion, like that's a very real fear that is hard to unlearn. And I want to
right.
acknowledge that. Like I'm kind of being a little flippant about it, but I don't mean to be, and I don't mean to like invalidate that feeling, because it's a very real feeling. And it's like me, like when I throw something away that I think I should be recycling or upcycling, like I get a little bit of that too, like, oh, I'm doing something bad, I'm doing something wrong. And it's like, okay, in the grand scheme of things, is it though? Yeah.
Yeah, I think I just want to build on what you said about, needing that scaffolding, like you said, and getting Hecate wrong. And like you said, I don't mean to diminish anyone. Like I understand that the desire to please Hecate, um, and the enthusiasm that when you get that ping and something opens up inside of you and you're like, oh, I just feel so connected to this whole super complicated goddess, witches, children, soul of the world, whatever that is. You know what I mean? Like you get, so I don't want to diminish wanting to propitiate her correctly.
Right.
Um, and at the same time, 100% on board with you that Hecate has bigger fish to fry. I love how you said fish to fry. So, of course, I'm thinking of the traditional Hecate supper, and that
Mhm.
fish was a big part of that meal. But
Absolutely.
even in that meal, like it wasn't like Hecate likes fish better than steak.
Right.
It was the areas the meal was offered in that certain type of fish was quite pricey.
Hmm.
And so to propitiate her, they used a special expensive fish.
Right.
Um, so, I don't, we always end up back with me talking about food. Sorry. You brought it up for the record. You said
I
fish.
can't help it. It's my Taurus sun and my Sagittarius moon and my Taurus Venus and my Taurus Jupiter. I like the finer things, including
Yeah, we
food.
need to talk about food when Taurus is in
Right.
the room. So, I totally understand that wanting to get it right.
Hmm.
And I will always very strongly advocate for following what feels right over getting it right based on what someone else told you.
Yeah.
And this is for me as someone who teaches rituals, a ritual cycle, and writes books. And for me, when I look back now, we've been doing this read along of the Keep Your Keep book for the past several months because I wanted to really honor that book, um, how Hecate presented to me at the time, and who I was at the time that I wrote that book, and do a complete overhaul because of the copy editing issues in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, so I've been very intimate with this book for the past several months. And so many times in the book, I'm basically like, you do you. Here's a thing, here's a way you could do this, but you do you.
Right.
And I know that confuses people because I get emails like every day. So you say we should start the book on the new moon. What do you mean by that? Or you know what I mean? Like you say this, and it's like, so when I try to create space for people to adapt things, it unintentionally causes confusion.
Right.
And I really learned over the past several years, that it's important, especially when people are first starting out, that there is like a template, a framework that they can explore and maybe experience kind of verbatim
Hmm.
the first few times and then start to find more space within it to adapt it. So that is something looking back to 5 years ago when it's been more than 5 years since I wrote the Keeping Her Keys book. I would write a preface to that book that says, I understand what it's like when you're first getting started. And I also encourage you to use your creativity. That for me, creativity is magic, creativity is of the goddess.
Hmm.
And as someone who is strongly driven by those things, um, just make your rituals, craft your talismans, create altars in a manner that lights you up. And if you need the structure of doing things exactly like I said, then there's no shame in that. Like, we're not here to invalidate anyone,
Right.
because I really think you hit upon a lot of points about the need that Saturnine needs sometimes for structure,
Hmm.
um, and just meeting people where they're at. Um, with the two of us kind of being really experienced in pagan circling, like we know what we're talking about.
Hmm.
Like between the two of us, we have a lifetime of experience of doing this. So,
Right.
but I think kind of when you and I came up in paganism and I guess like broader spirituality, the New Age, shamanism, like all of that world, like for us getting started before the internet was such a thing,
Hmm.
I think there's a real delineation, and that I suspect, and I know from Covina and talking to my readers, that a lot of the witches today don't have those experiences that you and I had. Going to the pagan meetup at the coffee shop,
Right.
because that was the only way To connect with other pagans.
right? Or lurking at the shop, like the weird, like, I don't know. I was lucky enough to grow up in Portland and live in Seattle during those times. So we had the weird shops, like we had the weird coffee shops that weren't necessarily pagan spaces, but like the other weirdos hung out there, you know, or we did have in Portland and in Seattle some very long running, pagan bookshops and occult bookshops. So I was very thankful for that. But, I was that kid who was like kind of always lurking there, but never really quite brave enough to like be a part of the group. So I have to say, that I figured out a lot of things on my own. Like I don't think I really even circled with a group until I was probably in my 20s, really, and I had been at that point pagan for whatever, witch or whatever you want to, I don't even know. Sometimes I don't even know what to call myself. But I had been on that path for probably 10 years before I really circled with a group. And it was an interesting experience. And then, to go back to the structure thing, I have to say, like, when, with all of the experience that I have, coming into Covina has really given me a really nice container for my magic and for deepening my practice and deepening my relationship with something bigger than me. And um, it's not something I really had found before Covina, I have to say. Like, I enjoyed being in circle with people, but to have like, it was, it's something that I have like a smaller circle of friends that I do magic with, and we had kind of created something similar for ourselves. But to have something that I could just kind of come into and like lay down that burden of trying to reinvent the wheel, I have to say I'm very thankful for that. So, going
Well,
back to like the positive side of having a structure or a container, like, yeah, it's really helped me a lot, I think.
well, thank you. And as the leader of Covina, like I do feel like I am growing into the role of being the leader of Covina. I'm not a very Saturnine person by nature. I am a creative educator, passionate about helping people, especially with, attachment and trauma, and learning to negotiate the need for structure with my kind of burning desire to help people unleash their inner creativity as a powerful means of healing from trauma. It's really been like, talk about a crossroads. If you think about the crossroads that I'm at every day,
Hmm.
where we are online, so I can't kind of go around to people and be like, oh, just be more creative, or
Right.
just let it go. We
Yeah.
do have to have certain rules about what we're doing.
Right.
I just really appreciate you saying that, and I do believe that Covina is a really special place. I could have never imagined myself doing this.
Hmm.
And for me, even the name of Covina, calling it the Covina Institute, my original name for my spiritual business was called Open Circle,
Hmm.
um, which was a kind of a subtle nod to witchiness and also a slight kind of kick in the shins to like the closed circling world that sometimes is, the cliques and whatnot that goes on in paganism. So I call it Open Circle, all are welcome.
Hmm.
And I wanted to call Covina that, and it just wasn't working when I first started. And I thought a long time, I was like, I don't want to call it Keeping Her Keys because I know Keeping Her Keys is the blog and the book, but this is so much, I hope this will become so much more than me someday. And
Hmm.
someday I can just kind of walk out the door and no one will notice that I've left.
Yeah.
That is my goal.
I get that. And we do have such a very supportive community. I mean, it is not just you, it's all of us. And, you're kind of at the helm, you're kind of herding the cats, like,
Hurting witches.
right, exactly. And I do appreciate, that I feel like there's a good amount of guidance without it being, there's not this expectation of perfectionism or this expectation of like, again, the dogma, the fundamentalists that you must do it my way because this is how I said to do it. There's like that, like, okay, here is, the basic structure. This is how I would do it and have fun, you know? Like,
And this is why, like, I am such a, like, the collaborative method. It's how I've always worked in research and academia as part of a team. And I'm really comfortable because I've been in that leadership role, leading collaborative teams
Hmm.
um, that were really diverse and inclusive. That's always kind of been my métier, that
Hmm.
I function best when I'm part of a really excellent team. And I think in Covina, I'm thinking about the craft circle we had yesterday. So it was a full moon, and our full moon salons, we do like an hour where there's a panel. We call our leaders and senior students in Covina guides. So there's always like a panel of guides. We do an offering. We do that first hour. Second hour, the full moon, our craft circles. And I was just thinking about, like, so we're doing our rebirth magical crafting art project. And so we're making caskets, which will eventually have a poppet, have an effigy inside of them. And we also do this other thing with paper roses that I'll explain some other time for people outside of Covina. Um, and I was just thinking, like, we had Nicole, our art educator, who did like the casket paper template. And then we had Kristen, who used a box, upcycling, repurposing. And then I was doing like how to use like a botanical stain that's really easy to make yourself. I actually went out, I did buy something this time for this project. And just thinking about like how collaborative that is, that we were able to show here's three different ways
Hmm.
you can approach making a casket. And we're all making caskets, but they can all be really individual. And to
Right.
me, having that really supportive team that's there guiding all the students through, like, that is the antithesis of spiritual programming to me, because what programming is like there is one leader and the one leader says all the right shit,
Hmm.
and you got to do what the one leader says.
Right.
And when Covina first started, it really felt like that to me.
Hmm.
And I never wanted to be that person. Like, I'm not joking when I say I want to be able to leave Covina someday and nobody notices.
Right.
Because I think as for Covina to become like a spirit, an organization onto itself, it needs to be able to mature into that and
Mm.
not be so linked to me that when I leave, it falls apart. You know,
Right.
it's not the Cyndi fan club. And when Covina felt like it was the Cyndi fan club, really had a really difficult time. And there's a few times I was like, I'm just going to shut it down and live off my meager royalties, because this isn't nourishing me. And that's when I think that's about the time that you landed, was after I made some vast changes in terms of like who was volunteering, who was on staff,
Hmm.
the structure and what we did, because I said either this is going to become something that nourishes me as much as it nourishes anybody else, and I won't feel like icky like High Priestess Cyndi.
Right.
Because during rituals, I am indeed High Priestess Cyndi, but most of the time, I'm just a leader. It's my job to keep everybody going forward, to develop really great curriculum, to host really spiritual and educational live gatherings. Like, my job is really clear to me, and I'm not a very hierarchical person, as you
Hmm.
know. So I think, like, hierarchical thinking when it comes to religious and spiritual practices is like a walloping piece of spiritual programming. Because
Right.
how many of these gurus do you see? Like, people are like, oh, my guru. It's all about my guru. My guru did all this for me.
Hmm.
Or, even like locally, Shambhala Buddhism, the kind of the world headquarters is located near here.
Hmm.
And they went through like a horrible thing where the leader of the organization was found was first accused, but also I think found to be guilty of, you know, at best sexual impropriety, at worst sexual assault and other horrible things.
Hmm.
And like, he just when an organization is the leader, it just opens up the leader to all kinds of nastiness
Mm-hmm.
because, like, you get that messiah complex.
Right.
And then people who emulate you like you're a messiah, I don't want that. And I don't think it is good for people.
Right.
But you see it like you see it everywhere. Like you see it in, I don't know, for whatever reason, that Joel Olstein, do you know who I mean?
Oh, yes.
He comes to mind. I don't know why he comes to mind, but I'm just thinking of like, like interviews I've seen with him in it and other people talking about him. It's like he's not I don't think he's Jesus, but you kind of sound like you're talking about Jesus.
Right, right. Yeah, that's a whole interesting phenomenon to be on the outside looking in for sure. Yeah.
So I guess our question to everybody would be like, do you pedestalize the spiritual leaders and teachers that you look up to? Do you dehumanize them
Mhm.
and see that they have more special powers than you do? Or do
Yeah.
you see that they are maybe more insightful, maybe more connected, more skilled, but they're not above you? Like that's for me, one of my big things is like, I don't want to be above anybody.
Mhm.
Um, I do feel like, the circle, we are a circle.
Yeah.
And I have a specific role within the circle to play, but that doesn't make me better than anybody else. And it doesn't make me like more special than anybody else. I said that to Liz the other day. So Liz and I recorded an episode with Nicholas Pearson, that's super awesome author of many books about stones and Reiki and flower essences.
Mhm.
And afterwards, we were talking, and I said, "Oh, I'm just a regular person." And she's like, "You're not a regular person." And I'm like, "Well, I see myself as a regular person." And I do think when it comes to our spiritual leaders, understanding that they're human too is a real big piece
Yeah,
of
I agree.
overcoming spiritual programming.
I agree. Because I mean, I even have that like in my other leadership roles. It's very interesting because it's like I just see myself as like, like my union work is a really good example. Like I'm just here on the ground with the rest of you. Like maybe I have some kind of experience in certain areas that makes me a little more knowledgeable, but like I just see my role as I'm here to do the work and I'm here to empower you to do the work as well. Like, and I think that to me, when I look at leaders in my life and who I look up to and who I want to learn from, those are the leaders that I look for. I look for a leader who is like, I have this knowledge and I want you to have it too. I have this power and I want you to have it too. Instead of the people who are like, I have this knowledge and power and I want to keep it to myself because that makes me special. Right?
Right, it's
Like,
so true. And I think Brene Brown calls this difference, like I think in her Dare to Lead book,
mhm.
she calls this difference power over and power with.
Yeah, I've heard that.
And I don't want to have power over anybody. And but I'd love to have power with you. Like you said, whether it's your union work, and for everyone watching and listening, Coyote Mae is a very accomplished
Mhm.
union organizer.
Thank you.
They, too humble. You're too humble, but um, so the whole idea of having power with, I think that's another key for overcoming spiritual programming. You have, sometimes I don't know if I remember how to say this exactly. I just remember having this big old fashioned debate with a pagan. We used to call them big nose pagans. Did you on the West Coast ever use that term, big nose pagans?
No, but we call them high Mechity Mex a lot,
Okay, so big
right?
nose pagans are the ones who like read serious books and think the rest of us are all kind of like failures at even paganism.
Right,
But failing at paganism is really different than like what you might think failure is. It's like having a career and owning a
right,
house.
right.
Um, so so I was arguing with this big nose pagan about different things. And I was just like, I don't even know what this fight is about. You know what I
Right.
mean? Like why is this even important? Like who
Mhm.
care? I don't actually care.
Right. And you're like, why am I here again? I should just go.
Right? There's like this so much minutia. I don't know. Have you ever gotten embroiled in the
Yeah.
winter solstice business?
Not in that so much, but in other things. Oh yeah. I mean, I think I've mentioned before within Covina, like in the chat and stuff, like there were some Facebook pages I've followed, especially around Hekate. And to be fair, some of those were Hellenic Reconstructionists, and if that's their thing, that's fine. But it was just funny because like I would be, doing my thing, and then I would read some of these things, and I'm just like, wow, y'all are spending a lot of energy arguing with each other about something that happened, millennia ago that nobody really knows for sure. And I mean, like, kudos to you for trying, like, for trying to, find out what they did and reconstruct that. And that's awesome. I mean, there was a time that I thought that was my path. So I have, some respect for that. But at the same time, I was kind of like, this is an argument that's never going to be settled, right? Like, and why am I here in this energy? Like, if that's what they want, that's fine for them. That's fine. Like, but I'm like, that is not for me. I don't really care that much. Right? Like,
And those reconstructionists, like that's like you talk like groups about who like to argue. My experience with the bulk of them is that they just like to argue and they like to pick on me because
yeah.
they somehow miss the whole thing that what I do is psycho-spiritual and I'm not trying to like say ancient Hecateans 2,500 years ago
Right.
sat in circles doing worksheets about their boundaries.
Right. And I'd like to think that she has evolved since then. I mean, that's my personal spiritual take on things, is that I think, like you said it in Keeping Her Keys, like she's not encased in concrete. Like she's not a static entity. Like the way she was 2,500 years ago is not necessarily who she is now. And that made a lot of sense to me because that's how I think about things too. I mean, like
Mhm.
just as we grow and evolve, and as the earth itself changes, right? I mean, like why wouldn't these, however you want to think about Hecate or any other deity, like these energies or these entities, like why wouldn't they change and grow too? Why
And
wouldn't
why
they
wouldn't our
adapt?
and why wouldn't like our human experience of them be rooted in our cultural, like where we are in our culture right now?
Right, right. Yeah.
So I think, what you're saying is it makes so much sense to me, right? It's like, of course, the divine like evolves the way we evolve. And I would say like my final tip for overcoming spiritual programming would be to go out and learn about the psychological concept about growth mindset versus fixed mindset if you don't already know that. Because in my experience, having a fixed mindset, there is a safety in that.
Mhm.
If we always do things a certain way and they don't change, that bad things won't happen, that there is like a sort of safety in that. And at the same time, it's actually not safe at all because our whole lives depend upon us having a growth mindset and adapting and changing to challenging circumstances, learning from both failures and successes. So for me, to overcome spiritual programming, have a growth mindset, to see this as a great journey where
Mhm.
you can learn and heal, have really beautiful experiences, and that it won't be perfect, that you will fail, but also that Hecate won't smite you.
Right.
There's no, what I think I've said recently, someone said something. I was like, we are not in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
If someone wants to live in the Old Testament, let them, but we'll be over here with our
Mhm.
growth mindsets,
Right.
allowing Hecate to come to us and all of our other spirits and gods and goddesses to come to us as the way they want to,
Mhm.
and enjoying enjoying the richness of it all. Like you started by talking about Greek myth and all of that rich history, all of without getting into kind of toxic cultural appropriation nonsense, but just that rich history from all around our beautiful world, whether you find it in the Catholic Mass, you find it in Druidism, whatever you find it in, just in a very respectful way, be curious and open to different ways of being in the world,
Mhm.
and that whatever is real and true and beautiful for you is most likely what you should be doing in terms of a spiritual practice. And I feel like we should probably do a follow-up episode on if it harms none, do what you will.
I don't think that would hurt.
Because, I feel like that's kind of like the elephant in the room,
That's the
especially for,
pagan Ten Commandments or the Wiccan Ten Commandments. I feel like,
right?
like, yeah.
And we didn't even have time to get into that whole thing about if it harms none, do what you will, and who said it, why there's problems, like the whole thing.
Right.
So maybe will you come back a third time and we'll talk about that?
Absolutely. Yeah, anytime. Yep.
All right, everyone, thanks so much for spending some time with Coyote May and I. Thanks for putting up with the squeakster voice and the hammering in the background, and we'll see you all again real soon. Oh, and hail Hecate.
Hail Hekate.